In our feature segment today, Asian carp. No, these foreign fish aren't being sold in the U.S., but their introduction into the Mississippi River years ago is causing big problems now.
Invasive carp reproduce with extraordinary efficiency. A single female can release hundreds of thousands, sometimes even millions, of eggs during a breeding season. If human pressure weakens for even a short time, the population can explode again. The people fighting this war began to understand a difficult truth. They could slow the carp. They could contain the carp. But they could not defeat them through spending alone. And that realization is where the story takes an unexpected turn. Because to understand what began returning to this river, you first have to understand what disappeared from it. Long before invasive carp entered these waters, before electric barriers were built, and before fishermen were paid to remove millions of pounds of fish, the Illinois River and the wider Mississippi Basin possessed a natural defense system of their own. They had predators, not ordinary predators, but ancient giants that had ruled these waters for millions of years. Powerful native hunters that shaped the ecosystem simply by existing. But over the last century, one by one, humans pushed these creatures toward the edges of their own world. Some were reduced, some were hunted, some disappeared completely. The river was not simply invaded by carp. It had already lost many of the defenders that once kept balance. The first returning defender is a fish most people rarely think about, the blue catfish. In its native rivers, the blue catfish is a true giant. It can grow beyond 100 pounds, with a massive mouth and an appetite powerful enough to match its size. For years, scientists believed blue catfish and invasive carp simply occupied different worlds. The carp were too large, too fast-growing, and too unfamiliar for native predators to consume. No one had documented a native fish in the Mississippi Basin successfully eating an adult big-headed carp. The assumption was simple. The invader had grown beyond the reach of the food web it entered. But then researchers decided to look closer. In a quiet backwater of the Mississippi River near Alton, Illinois, scientists captured blue catfish and examined what they had been eating. What they discovered challenged everything they thought they knew. Adult silver carp were not just appearing occasionally in the diets of these catfish. They were the most important prey item by weight. When researchers examined the stomach contents, they found silver carp in roughly 70% of the blue catfish they studied. For the first time, scientists had evidence of something remarkable. A native predator, living in the middle of the invasion, was already hunting the invader. No one trained it. No one introduced it. No one designed a program to make it happen. The blue catfish had simply encountered a new abundance of food and recognized it for what it was: a meal. That is the advantage of a true heavyweight. The reason most native fish cannot consume adult carp is not just about hunger, it is about size. A fish several feet long requires a predator with the physical ability to swallow it. The blue catfish has that ability. With its enormous mouth and powerful body, it represents one of the few native species capable of challenging the largest invasive carp. It does not need to be engineered. It does not need to be manufactured. It only needs to survive and continue doing what it evolved to do. Be a predator, a natural force working at the top of the river, performing a job no machine can replicate. But the next defender carries an even deeper story. A creature that was almost erased from these waters forever. The alligator gar. Seeing one for the first time feels like looking into the distant past. This fish can grow nearly 8 feet long and weigh more than 300 pounds. Its body is covered with armor-like scales so hard that early settlers sometimes used them for arrowheads. Its long, narrow snout is filled with rows of sharp teeth designed for capturing prey. It is one of the largest freshwater fish in North America, a living survivor from an ancient world when enormous creatures dominated these rivers. And among all the native fish in the Mississippi Basin, the alligator gar holds a special place. It is considered one of the only native predators truly capable of attacking fully grown adult invasive carp. But before the carp became a crisis, humans had already nearly removed this defender from the ecosystem. For much of the 20th century, alligator gar were misunderstood. They were labeled as useless. They were called trash fish. Many people believed they threatened valuable game species, and they were killed whenever they were found. Across the northern parts of their historic range, they disappeared. In Illinois, the final confirmed alligator gar was caught in 1966 in a southern stream known as the Cache River. After that, silence. For decades, the fish that had hunted these waters for thousands of years was gone. By the 1990s, Illinois considered the alligator gar extinct within the state. The river's greatest native predator of large fish had vanished before the invasive carp ever arrived. The ecosystem had lost one of its most important defenders, and humans were responsible. But eventually, understanding replaced fear, and restoration began. Starting in 2010, the Illinois Department of Natural Resources, working with federal partners, began an effort to return the alligator gar to its former home. Young gar were raised in hatcheries using broodfish collected from the lower Mississippi River. Then, they were released into southern Illinois waters where their ancestors once dominated. From 2010 through 2025, biologists released more than 21,000 alligator gar into a dozen waterways across the state. They tagged them, they tracked them, and slowly, one of North America's oldest freshwater predators began its journey back into a river that had forgotten it. They tagged the fish, they tracked them, and year by year, something that once seemed impossible began to happen. The giants started returning to a river that had forgotten it. But the people leading this restoration effort are careful with their words, and honesty requires that we are careful too. The biologists who brought the alligator gar back will tell you something important. They did not restore this ancient predator simply because they wanted a new weapon against invasive carp. That was never the primary mission. They brought it back because an extinction had happened, because a missing piece of a living ecosystem had been removed, because a predator that had shaped these rivers for thousands of years deserved to return to the waters where it belonged. And they are equally honest about another reality. The alligator gar, by itself, will never be enough to eliminate invasive carp. The numbers are simply too different. Carp populations are measured in tons per river mile, while alligator gar populations are still measured in thousands of individual fish. No scientist is claiming that a handful of restored giants can suddenly solve an invasion of this scale. But that honesty is exactly what makes the story more powerful, because the alligator gar does something no machine can do. It eats carp. It is a predator designed by evolution to hunt large, soft-bodied fish in open water. And now, after decades of imbalance, the rivers are filled with exactly the kind of prey it evolved to pursue. As the gaillard population slowly grows, spreads, and begins reclaiming parts of its former territory, it adds another layer of pressure against the invaders. Another predator, another force at the very top of the food chain. A force that no electric barrier can create. The alligator gar is not a weapon that humans invented. It is a defender that humans removed. And now, after generations of absence, it is being welcomed home. By returning, it is quietly resuming a role it performed for thousands of years, a role it never forgot. The third defender of this river carries an even older story, the bowfin. If the alligator gar is ancient, the bowfin is almost beyond imagination. Its lineage stretches back more than 150 million years, all the way to the age of dinosaurs. Every other member of its ancient family disappeared long ago, leaving behind only fossils. But the bowfin survived. It continues to swim through the swamps, wetlands, and slow-moving backwaters of North America, looking almost unchanged from the creatures that existed when giant reptiles ruled the planet. It is a survivor built for difficult places. Unlike many modern fish, the bowfin can breathe air by gulping oxygen at the surface with a primitive lung-like organ, allowing it to survive in warm, stagnant waters where other species would struggle or die. It is a patient predator, a powerful ambush hunter with a long body, a heavy head, and rows of sharp teeth. It hides among weeds and flooded trees, waiting motionless until the perfect moment arrives. Then, in less than 1/10 of a second, it strikes. And the places where the bowfin lives are exactly the places that matter most in the carp invasion. There is a river hidden in the heart of the American Midwest where something extraordinary is happening beneath the surface. Something no engineer designed, no government committee approved, and no human mind planned. Above the water, it looks like any other working river, carrying boats, supporting towns, and cutting through the farmland of the continent. But below the brown surface, in the quiet backwaters and slow-moving pools, a forgotten force has begun to awaken. An old order, one that existed long before money, machines, and modern solutions, is slowly returning. For decades, people fought a war here. They fought it with technology, with barriers, with research teams, and with hundreds of millions of dollars. They built walls of electricity beneath the water. They created systems designed to stop an invasion that seemed unstoppable. But while humans were building defenses above the surface, something else was happening below. A different kind of solution was forming silently, written in the ancient language of nature itself. This is the Illinois River, a 270-mile waterway that cuts through the center of America before turning north toward the Great Lakes. For most of its history, this river was not considered mysterious or dangerous. It was a working river. Barges carried grain through its channels. Communities grew along its banks. Fishermen pulled catfish from its waters. Generations of people lived beside it without realizing that beneath the surface existed a delicate ecosystem built on millions of years of evolution. But then, in the early 1980s, everything began to change. The beginning of the crisis did not happen in Illinois. It started hundreds of miles away with what seemed like a smart and practical decision. During the 1970s, fish farms and water treatment facilities across the southern United States were struggling with a growing problem. Their ponds were filling with algae, weeds, and unwanted plant growth. They needed a solution, something efficient and inexpensive that could clean the water naturally. The answer came from the rivers of East Asia. Scientists and farmers introduced several species of large carp into American waters. Silver carp and bighead carp were brought in because they were powerful filter feeders, capable of consuming enormous amounts of microscopic plankton floating in the water. Grass carp were introduced because they could consume unwanted aquatic vegetation. Black carp were valued because their powerful throat teeth could crush hard-shelled creatures like snails and mussels. At first, everything seemed to work perfectly. These fish were like living water treatment machines. They were efficient, inexpensive, and incredibly effective. They performed exactly the job humans wanted them to do. For a while, they remained where they were placed. But rivers have always had their own plans. Then came the floods. The Mississippi River Basin has always been shaped by rising waters. Floods are not unusual events here. They are part of the natural rhythm of the landscape. But when those floodwaters overwhelmed ponds and containment areas, they carried something unexpected into the open river system. The carp escaped. And what followed was not a slow expansion. It was a takeover. These fish entered a continent where nothing had evolved to stop them. The rivers of the Midwest offered exactly what they needed: warm water, endless food, and vast connected waterways. They found a world filled with plankton-rich rivers, but almost no natural enemies capable of controlling them. For the first time, these fish were free, and the ecosystem had no answer. To understand why the invasion became so serious, you have to understand the silver carp itself. A fully grown silver carp can reach more than 3 feet in length and weigh over 60 pounds. But its greatest advantage is not its size. It is the way it feeds. Using a specialized filtering system inside its gills, the silver carp can remove enormous amounts of microscopic plankton from the water almost constantly. And plankton is not just another food source. It is the foundation of the entire river ecosystem. Every small fish, every young predator, and every creature connected to the food chain depends on this invisible world of microscopic life. Remove enough plankton, and the entire structure above it begins to collapse. When silver carp arrived in massive numbers, they did not simply become another species in the river. They began consuming the very foundation that supported everything else, and their numbers grew beyond anything people expected. In some sections of the Illinois River, silver carp populations became so enormous that scientists measured them not by counting individual fish, but by estimating their weight per mile of river. The water was no longer simply occupied by carp. It was dominated by them. Native fish suddenly found themselves competing against millions of constantly feeding invaders. Mussel populations declined. Native fish struggled to find enough food. The river was still alive, but the balance had shifted. The ecosystem was becoming something completely different. Then came the behavior that made silver carp famous around the world. They fly. When boats travel through areas filled with silver carp, the vibration of the engines can send the fish into a panic. Hundreds of pounds of fish can launch themselves from the water at once, creating a bizarre and dangerous spectacle. Fish the size of small dogs have crashed into boats, injured passengers, and shattered windshields. Videos of these flying fish spread across the internet, transforming silver carp into both a curiosity and a symbol of environmental disaster. But the jumping was only the surface-level problem. The real danger was much deeper, because at the northern end of this river system was a doorway, and behind that doorway was one of the greatest freshwater resources on Earth. The Illinois River is connected through canals near Chicago to Lake Michigan. Together, the Great Lakes contain roughly 1/5 of the planet's fresh surface water and support ecosystems and industries worth billions of dollars. If invasive carp established themselves in the Great Lakes, scientists feared the consequences could be enormous and possibly irreversible. The Illinois River had become the battlefield, and humans responded with everything they had. Government agencies, researchers, and conservation groups began spending enormous amounts of money trying to stop the invasion. By 2020, federal and state efforts had already consumed nearly $600 million in attempts to control and contain invasive carp, and experts warned that even this figure was likely an underestimate. The largest part of the battle was infrastructure. Engineers began designing some of the most advanced aquatic defenses ever created. Electric barriers were placed in waterways. Sound systems, underwater bubbles, and advanced monitoring technology were developed to create a final line of defense between the carp and the Great Lakes. But the more scientists studied the river, the more they began to realize something important. The solution might not come only from machines, because beneath the surface, something older was beginning to return, something that had been missing from this river for generations: the predators. Far down the Illinois waterway, near the town of Joliet, a new kind of battlefield was created. This place became known as Brandon Road, and here engineers designed one of the most ambitious attempts ever made to stop an invasive species. It was not a simple barrier. It was a technological gauntlet designed to challenge the carp at every possible level. Beneath the water, a wall of electricity would attempt to turn the fish away. Powerful curtains of bubbles would create physical disturbances. Underwater speakers would blast unfamiliar sounds to confuse and repel them. Special flushing systems would push smaller fish back downstream before they could move farther north. It was a battle fought with science, engineering, and enormous financial investment. The Brandon Road project alone was projected to cost more than $1 billion and require years of construction. And even before that system was completed, another line of defense was already operating closer to Lake Michigan. Deep beneath the surface of the canal, an electric barrier pulsed constantly, standing as the final checkpoint between the invasive carp and one of the largest freshwater ecosystems on Earth. But humans did not rely only on machines. Along hundreds of miles of river, state agencies turned to a much older method. They hired fishermen. Commercial crews were sent into the places where carp gathered. They stretched enormous nets across the water, searched quiet channels, and removed the invaders one catch at a time. Governments created contracts and incentives, paying crews to do something that seemed almost impossible: reduce a population that seemed endless. And the results were staggering. Over the past 15 years, crews removed roughly 50 million pounds of invasive carp from the Illinois River. When combined with decades of independent commercial fishing efforts, the total removal climbed beyond 100 million pounds. To understand that number, imagine the weight of around 5,000 elephants being pulled from a single river, one net at a time. For a while, it worked. But it worked in the same way that holding back a powerful predator works. It created control, not a permanent solution. In the upper pools of the Illinois River, closer to Lake Michigan, relentless removal reduced carp numbers enough to slow their advance. The invasion was pushed back. The front line was held miles away from the Great Lakes. But this was not victory. It was a siege. And a siege against a species that never stops multiplying is a battle with no clear ending. The quiet backwaters, the flooded forests, the slow-moving channels, and the hidden nurseries where young invasive carp grow before becoming massive adults. Carp begin life differently from the giants people see flying from boats. They start small. Their eggs drift through the current, and their young eventually settle into calm areas where they can feed and develop. Those are the same environments where the bowfin has hunted for millions of years. And just like the alligator gar, the bowfin was once misunderstood. For much of the last century, people viewed it as a useless fish, a trash species, a predator blamed for damaging populations of bass and crappie. Anglers killed them because they believed they were protecting valuable game fish. But once again, humans had misunderstood the role of a native predator. The bowfin was not destroying the ecosystem, it was helping balance it. It was an opportunistic hunter, feeding on whatever small fish were most abundant in its environment. And today, in backwaters filled with young invasive carp, those small fish are increasingly becoming the bowfin's newest source of food. The ancient survivor hiding beneath the surface has quietly added the river's newest threat to a diet that began millions of years before the carp ever arrived. But the bowfin is not fighting this battle alone. It is part of something much larger, a natural response spreading throughout the ecosystem. When researchers studied what was consuming juvenile carp in the Illinois River, they discovered that the young invaders were appearing inside many different native fish. Largemouth bass, white bass, black crappie, channel catfish, freshwater drum, yellow perch, and short-nose gar. Species that had existed alongside one another for generations were now responding to the new abundance of prey in the river. They were not recognizing the carp as an enemy. They were simply recognizing them as food. Some species, including white bass, crappie, and short-nosed gar, even appeared to prefer young carp over certain native prey, especially as traditional food sources became harder to find. Scientists have a name for this natural response. They call it biotic resistance. It is the ability of a native ecosystem to push back against an invading species using its own living systems, predators, competition, and natural pressures that evolved over thousands or millions of years. But there is an important truth about biotic resistance. It is powerful, but it is not magic. On its own, it cannot completely stop an invasion as massive as this one. The carp grow too quickly. They reproduce too efficiently. And by the time a silver carp reaches its second year, it has often grown beyond the size that most native predators can handle. Bass and crappie can consume the young, but they cannot challenge the giants. So this is not a story about three fish suddenly defeating a problem that hundreds of millions of dollars could not solve. That would not be the truth. The real story is much quieter, and in many ways much more remarkable. Because what is happening in the Illinois River is not a single dramatic victory. It is something far older, a living system beginning to repair itself. The river is doing what ecosystems do when they are given the opportunity. It is adapting. The blue catfish at the top of the food chain is learning to consume adult carp. The returning alligator gar is reclaiming the role of the giant predator. The bowfin, bass, and crappie are reducing the number of young invaders before they can grow. None of them is the complete answer, but together they represent something no engineer could ever build. A river that has started fighting back from within. Together, they are something the engineers could never build. A river that has begun to eat its own invader. And slowly, almost unnoticed, the numbers are beginning to change. In the upper pools of the Illinois River, the combined force of human intervention, relentless carp removal, and the growing appetite of native predators has pushed carp populations down far enough that scientists are beginning to see signs of recovery.